Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Ethics of Now from Home, a series of community conversations of contemporary relevance that we generally hold in downtown Durham a few times a semester through the Keenan Institute of Ethics, but that we are now holding from our various homes, inspired by the good folks at Saturday Night Live or by Jimmy Fallon. Ideally, mostly less silly than both of those, but not always. I am Adrienne Lentz-Smith. I will be your host for today's conversation. And we're going to talk this week about shifting foundations, cultural changes and changes in values in the era of the pandemic. The way that this is going to go is that I will talk to our guest for until about, I'd say, 7:40, and then we'll turn to fielding your questions. That'll give us about a good 15 or so minutes to take Q&A, and then we will wind down at 8 o'clock or thereabouts. You will just see me and our guest, who today will be Steve Vaisey, but there's a whole team of folks from Keenan who are working in the shadows on the catwalk above my desk. So if there are any technological problems or any issues like that, they're on it. And the way this will work for your questions is that the chat function has been disabled. So instead, you will use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. Just type your questions in. Folks from Keenan will gather them, and we will try to address as many of them as possible. With that, I'm going to get going. I'm also going to turn off my email, so hopefully you don't get those terrible little pings. And please let me introduce Steve Vaisey. It's my great pleasure. He is a professor of sociology and political science here at Duke University. I say here as if we're here at Duke University, there at Duke University. And he's the director of the Worldview Lab at the Keenan Institute for Ethics. The lab's main goal is to better understand diversity in values, goals, and worldviews, both internationally and within contemporary American society. Steve's research focuses on where people get their ideas about what a good life looks like and what it means to be a good person, and to determine how this shapes the choices that they make. Most generally, he examines why people do the things they do and figures out the role of culture and cognition in explaining human behavior. He has also conducted research on 1970s communes, religion, and marijuana use. I think those are not all one project, although I could imagine ways in which they would be, on educational overqualification, gene-environment interactions, and the relationship between poverty and educational aspirations, among other things. I should note, and we forgive him for this, that he holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina, but no one is perfect. So I guess that's your one thing.
Yeah.
And with that, I'll turn to our conversation.
Hey,
So,
good to be
hi,
here.
it's good to have you. How are you holding up?
Yeah, pretty well, actually. It's kind of feels like the new normal now, which it's not, but I keep telling myself that it is. So
Right.
day by day.
It's like when I go on road trips with my children and I tell them, just pretend like you live in the car. Don't ask when we're getting out of the
That's it.
car.
That's it.
This is what I said about our stay-at-home order. We live
Yeah,
in the car.
yeah. No,
Just
it's a lot of walks. Yeah, a lot of walks. Let's put it that way.
so I wanted to start with a question that I swear I think of as a small question, and no one seems to agree with me. And there was a moment when I was a graduate student when I got obsessed with how much everybody seemed to be talking about culture and no one would define it for me. And so I would go around to people. I remember I went to the cultural studies sort of guru, Paul Gilroy, and I said, Paul, how would you define culture? And Paul said, oh my, I wouldn't dare to try,
Yeah.
which was a hilarious and unsatisfying answer. And
Yeah.
then I asked a cultural historian, Matt Jacobson, whose answer was, oh, that's easy. It's any product of an engaged mind,
Mm.
which is actually helpful, but really big.
Sure.
And so, still asking the question 20 some odd years on, I'll
Yeah.
ask, hey, so Steve, how would you, as someone who studies culture, like
Yeah.
define culture?
Yeah, I'm on the side of that's a hard question, but I will say I think it's the way I try to use it is, when I'm talking to my students is the idea that there are things that everybody has in common. So they're human universals, and there are things that sort of are idiosyncratic to us. Like what was the name of my third grade teacher, whatever, and kind of everything in the middle, everything that we share with some people, but not with other people. That's what I would think of as cultural. So it's the stuff that we know or know how to do that we learn from other people. So
Okay.
that's I guess what it is, which is still huge, obviously.
Right.
But I try to think about other questions like what is energy or what is life. So we're not the
Right.
only people who have these problems.
Right. It's like, um, and so, I mean, let's also think a little bit about the premise of this entire conversation,
Yeah,
right? And I've had this conversation or variations on it. I hear it all the time, right? That COVID-19 has changed things,
yeah.
that there are shifts afoot. And so my first question is, do you agree? Like, is this a moment of rupture? Um,
It's
and
a good.
what does that mean for what you study?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super good question. And to come back to the thing that you said, a minute ago, which is that culture is, how do you define it? It's so many things. And I think one of the things that I use culture for is to think about is almost like a branding tool, because in reality you don't study culture. You can't study culture any more than you can study life. You know what I
Right.
mean? And so I think it's really useful to disaggregate culture into its different components. And there are public components of culture, there are private components of culture, there are sort of practices, there are beliefs, there are habits, there are all kinds of things like that. So I think some things, I mean, the short answer, I guess, is that I think for some things, it is a moment of rupture. And for some things, it's not. I mean, which is not very helpful. But I do think that in general, my impression is that it's going to be less. It's going to be a uh, less have less impact on people's private opinions and private values than I think many commentators that I'm seeing, at least on Twitter and places like that, are thinking.
So when they talk about those values, like, what does that mean? Like, what values and opinions or
Yeah, I just mean like I mean, you look politically. I mean, I was actually looking in sort of preparation for our conversation. I was just sort of googling around, seeing like what other people had said about these things, because like you said, I mean, people are talking about this topic, and one of the things that I found was somebody saying, oh, we'll have less political. This is in like March, so this was a couple months ago, like right at the beginning. And it was like, what are some of the cultural changes going to be from this? And two of the things that I found that were in the same article, I can't remember where this was, but it was a decent place. But it was a greater respect for experts and less polarization.
right?
And so I was
Oh.
like, wow, your prediction of 2 months out was like already pretty bad, because
Right.
I think that it's this stuff is that kind of private opinion, like who you trust, what you think is real. Those things are deep, deep, deep down, and those don't change very easily. And so, yeah, I don't see a lot of that stuff changing, and I don't think that either one of those things will be a resulting. I mean, I think we'll have greater polarization. I think there are people who already believed. I mean, okay, let me give you an example, like climate science. There are a lot of people who, and I'm sure the people who are tuned into this, are people who are like, yeah, I'm enlightened. I believe in climate change. I believe in answer human caused climate change, and we have to do something about it. But if you really think about it, I mean, part of it is like I'm not a climate scientist. You're not a climate scientist. Lots of these people aren't climate scientists. So it's not like I've looked at the science and I've decided that there's climate change. No, I mean, what you do is you trust a process, you trust an institution, you trust people, experts in those institutions. And I think, so it's on that basis. It's the sort of general trust in science, the general trust in the scientific process, the scientific method that, that makes me believe in climate change. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the same sort of dynamics here. It's who do you trust? It's not like, oh, have you've evaluated the public health research and you have decided that this is going to be an effective method. It's like, no, I mean, we want to listen to Dr. Fauci, and some people like us are, who are on that team or whatever. Or, we're like, okay, yeah, this is what we're going to do, because this is how you respond to a thing like this. There are people who know more than you about specific issues, and you answer them. So I think, and then there are people who are strongly opposed to that, as you've seen. So I mean, there these protests and different things. I think I kind of have ceased being surprised, to be honest, by some of these things that happen. People really can just live in like totally different informational worlds. I don't think that affects them like on a daily basis when they're getting groceries or things like this. But when it comes to these sort of symbolic, worlds where there's not like a direct, like a direct cause. I mean, nobody's out there saying like, "Oh, traffic accidents aren't real." I'm going to walk out in the street, because it's too immediate. There's too immediate of a causal connection. But whenever you get that separation, like in economics or politics, or places like that, you get that separation between cause and effect. There's a huge scope for people to live in kind of different realities. So I am skeptical that some of these predictions will come true, because I think a lot of those values and basically things you trust are baked in. They're baked in already.
So baked in from where? And when do they get baked?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm doing a lot of research on this now, and essentially what we want to know. So my student Kevin Kiley and I have been working on this a lot, and I've been working on it with some other collaborators as well. And essentially, demographers know this. There are a few different kinds of change that you can have. So let's say we just say, okay, older people are more conservative than younger people. So let's just posit that. There are a
The
couple
good
reasons.
people of Durham, the good like baby boomers of Durham, North Carolina, are like,
Hey, on average, on average. So if you notice a trend like that, then our tendency is to think, well, that's old. As people get older, our tendency is to think about it developmentally. As people get older, they become more conservative. But there's another explanation, which is that people were born at a different time. They had early formative experiences from, let's say, the age of birth to the age of 25 or so, where they had some experiences that affected the way they think about this. And so it could be that the reason they're conservative is because they were born, in the 1940s, and it's not because they're older. You know what I mean? And those are two different things. And so we can only study those things if we follow multiple cohorts of people, over time. You can start to get some leverage on why it is, or what the mechanisms of change are. Whether there's what's called a period effect, which is everybody being affected by what's happening now. There are age effects, things that change as we get older and younger, and then there are cohort effects, which are sort of the long-term effects of what conditions were like when you were younger. And for most things, in my research, and I've approached this a bunch of different ways. We have stuff that, I mean, obviously the kind of data that I primarily use is based on surveys. And so a lot of the info we have only goes back to the 70s, or in the earliest case, the 50s. But over that period, there's very little evidence that for most things, people are changing their minds, like adults. There's evidence that kids are changing their minds. So I mean, and the reason to believe this is like, I mean, there are many reasons. There are a lot of pieces of evidence, and I don't want to get too much into the technicalities because there's a lot of statistics involved in things. But basically, what happens is, if you follow somebody 3 times and they're really changing. So this is the latest study we're doing. If you follow somebody 3 times and they're really changing, them 2 years ago should be more similar to now than them 4 years ago. I mean, so if somebody's actually on a journey, so if someone's like traveling to your house and you call them like half an hour later, they should be closer to your house. You know what I mean? They should be not just like bouncing around in space. And so, one of the things you can do is basically see, hey, are people on a journey? Are they traveling in some kind of consistent direction in their beliefs, or is it just sort of bouncing around their own average? And what you find is that for the vast majority of things, there's very little evidence that people are changing in any sort of consistent way. Most people just they have sort of one time you get them and they're like, oh, I'm slightly conservative, and the next time you get them they say they're extremely conservative, and the next time you get up they say I'm conservative. I mean, so they're bouncing, and it looks like we feel like it's change. Right. But for the most part, it's actually just people bouncing around habits that they form. But adolescents don't look like that. I mean, that's what we're working on now. We haven't published that, but adolescents actually are changing. So that's where we get this idea. I mean, this idea's been around a long time, but that's where we get the idea that this stuff gets baked in when you're, and as far as the evidence I can see, the most formative period looks to be about between like age 10, younger than 10, it doesn't seem to matter that much for politics and things like that. But, between say 10 25, that's what matters. Then after that, you're kind of just playing out that, that what got baked in.
Yeah. So that's it. So I have two different ways that my brain wants to respond. One is as like historian
Yeah,
me,
sure.
and the other is as just me.
Yeah, sure.
And
We'll do both.
okay, so the me is actually had this flash of being at my college reunion 20 years out of college and looking around and being struck at how college, this moment where I thought we were all on our way to becoming whoever we were going to become, that was different from who we started out and would be different even still further out. And then I saw people who'd kind of reverted to their class identities or their
Yeah,
social positions or their and I was like, oh, college wasn't a stop on the way to elsewhere. It was a stepping outside
yeah,
before a return to a place that folks already were,
absolutely.
right?
Yes.
Um, and so anecdotally, right, some part of me is like, oh, I totally get that.
Yeah.
The part of me, like the historian part of me, who thinks about the number of formations or processes or political configurations or attitudes
Yeah.
that you see in, say, 19, or let's say actually 2010,
Yeah,
that
sure.
my students will be like, oh my God, it's just like 1940. And I say, well, no, it's not just like 1940. A lot of things have happened between
Yeah.
1940 and 2010. It's like,
Yeah.
what's really interesting is how there can be all kinds of change, and as things remake themselves, they remake themselves in such a way that looks so similar to something that preceded them
Yeah,
that
sure.
it's hard to see the change. Do you see?
Yeah, sure. And I think part of that is because there's only so many ways to organize this. I mean, so okay, let's talk about the case of, I think this will in some ways address your point. It's an illustration, the case of gay marriage, for example, or like gay rights in general, which is an issue that people often bring up to me as sort of a counter example.
Like, example, like this happens a lot faster,
Yeah,
you
like
would
people
say?
change. No, that people change. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That people change. So, so first of all, there is some evidence that that's true, and part of that is that um, in a culture you can have things that are like super salient. You can have things that everybody's paying attention to, and so those things can actually change faster because everybody's paying attention to
Right.
them. But everybody can't pay attention to everything. So the number of slots for like high salience events is relatively limited. But even then, most of the change on gay marriage, for example, we want to take gay rights, like legal rights, has been relatively quick. But if you look at the evidence about like the morality of
Right.
homosexuality, like is it moral, is it ethical for people of the same sex to engage in sexual relations? That change is much more that's much more cohort based. That means like basically older people who thought it was wrong are dying, like on average, and like younger people are who don't think it's as bad are moving in, and so over time the composition of the population is changing. But one of the things that when people study this, I mean, and because it's very hard to study, and I wouldn't say that I've found a way to do this super well because of the kind of data we have, but is the difference between public attitudes and private attitudes. I think what happens is a lot of times you have a subtle, um, slow change with cohort replacement, like people dying and other people, coming into the adult world. And there's a sort of slow private change, and it doesn't seem like anything's really changing on the outside. And then some kind of event or some kind of thing will happen that will cause a change that actually is kind of already in practice, kind of already happening.
Right.
And so a lot of people, like if you look at Will and Grace or things like that from the 90s, or it's not like that caused people to be like, oh, I'm cool with this now. I think what things like that do is they allow you to see that other people don't have a problem with it either. And so
Right.
the idea is not that, it's not like, well, I used to hate gay people and but I saw Will and Grace and now my eyes have been open. I mean, it's more like, I'm fine with this. It's not my thing, but, I'm fine with it. People should live their lives. They should do what they want. But I think other people are really opposed to it. But, then the show comes out that's really popular. It's like, oh, okay, maybe more people are, okay with this. And so I think there's a big distinction that in my work I found to be like really important between public culture, like the kinds of things we say and the kind of things that we believe that other people believe, and then the stuff that we sort of privately care about. Because I think most, if you look at the support for most, things like this, it's not like most people in the if you do if you do a survey and you say, oh, 70% of the US population, supports gay marriage. That doesn't mean they're out there on the barricades. Like, it just means they're like, 95% of those people are just like, sure, whatever, it's not like and so I think what that is it's an erosion, not in a bad way, but it's just a slow change. I mean, that's the metaphor. It's a slow change.
So
Revealed later. So, but I think like with Zoom, like, okay, so this very thing we're doing right now, I think that has been slowly in the background changing, where people are getting more comfortable with this sort of thing. And so if you want to talk about how we relate to each other at work, this is going to be a big change. We're going to be Zooming a lot more.
Oh Lord. Oh Lord. And this is where I'm also like a lag person. I still every once in a while call it Skype. I'm like, wait, I already chose the product that became my verb, and you just want me to move.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and so yeah, part of it's practice. But then I was also going to ask, what role do institutions or like, I mean, in some abstract way, this is a question about the relationship between culture and power, but it's also about how certain like norms are produced presumably through communities and sort of like broad publics saying that this is how we do things. But there are some either people or entities whose weight matters, who have more weight, right?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. No, I think, no, that certainly is part of it. And so that it has to be weighted by that. There's when you have these times of flux, I mean, you have, you know, some people are, Zoom is in a position to, to change the norms more than AT&T, you know what I mean? So, I mean, if you want to take it that way, or individual people, so Jeff Bezos has more, ability to change norms around, like, oh yeah, we're all going to be getting our, COVID-19 antibody tests through Amazon Prime, I mean, like obviously that kind of stuff, money, power, that definitely makes a big difference. But those are ways of like publicly organizing life. And I do think the public ways of organizing life can be more malleable because they depend on these institutions. Like, it doesn't matter if I think fax machine is the best technology ever, like that my private attitude doesn't like matter because I can't send anybody a fax, well, I probably can, but not really.
Not really.
Yeah. And so there are things like that they depend on other people. So institutions. So I would say like individuals are actually relatively slow to change, but institutions like that, especially institutions that are relatively thin, like nobody cares that much about whether we use Zoom or whether we use Google Meet or whether we use. I mean, like at the beginning, no one would have cared, but now that we're sort of converging on this, then it matters because that's what everybody else is doing. So.
I was looking around my desk to see if I could find my flip phone, because I feel like this is another one where it's just basically like nobody cares. They mock me a little that I have the flip phone, but as all kinds of work becomes done via text or what have you, so to track back to this question, I mean, the rupture, the shift versus dramatic change, if how we think about community and our responsibility towards one another and the line, to use the talk of the people who are shouting, between my safety and someone else's like notion of freedom. Right? Like, so, I mean, your conversation would suggest that stuff could move a lot more quickly than most things move.
Well, this is what I would say. It's in a situation like that. I mean, you're right. If you look at what's going to happen or what's happening, I think that's exactly right. But it's not because people are changing their minds. It's because the situation has changed, and people who already wanted to. So, like the people who were already to disregard other people's safety for their freedom have an enormous opportunity to do that right now, for example. And the kind of people who have their priorities the other way have an enormous opportunity not only to do it, but also to enforce that norm and to signal it to. I mean, if you look at like a lot of what like mask wearing and things like that is, I mean, it's not just wearing a mask, it's wearing a mask so that other people can see that you're wearing a mask. I mean, like so you're at least if you're me, I mean, obviously I'm a little weird, but you're self-consciously to some extent out there saying like, this is what my group does. We don't go crowd in a restaurant on Mother's Day, and we wear masks and we socially distance, and so those are ways of showing the kind of people we are. But I guess what I would say is the kind of people we were was already set. And so
Right.
this is an opportunity to show what kind of people we are. And it's a big opportunity for things to bifurcate, just like an election is in a way. I mean, in a way, this is like, it's an opportunity that's like an election that's taking like a long, long time. And I do think it's possible. I mean, it's hard to imagine in these days, but it's possible to imagine that we could have had a less politicized version of this with a certain kind of leadership, like where it's not being, because these kind of things can get tied to political identity, because that's where people figure out like, I don't have like strong views on like, water use rights and all sorts of things that I haven't had the time to think about. So that's why we have political parties. I mean, the one way we have political parties is for heuristics. So I can say like, look, I have a group that I trust, and I'm not going to agree with them on everything. But like, if I got to pick, my team is, I'm going to start there as my sort of default. So I think what's happening now is this is. I don't think it's creating division. I think it's revealing division. That was already there, that we've been seeing a ton of, and it's sad, but I think that's what, I think there are people out there who like, just like when they go out without a mask, they're making a statement. When I go out with a mask, I'm making a statement, and we're having an argument.
Right. And I mean, for again, the mask wearing example specifically, why you wear it differs. So in the co-op, which even shopping at the co-op is an announcement of a certain kind of membership of
For
certain
sure,
kinds of
yeah.
tribes, right? But like in the co-op, I'm wearing a mask because safety, like nobody can figure out which way the one-way lanes go.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
that's a self-interest. Walking the dog in the park where the mask is in my pocket and I quickly put it on
yeah.
when folks are approaching is less about safety than about my sort of innate southernness that feels a need to say hello to someone, but you can't really say hello to someone, but the mask says I acknowledge and care about you,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to speak, like you're right, it's a performance of a certain kind.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think that, I mean, if one thing that I think people will take away from this, especially younger people, is that it's just hard to imagine a world where everything is not political right now. And I thought it was bad before. And it's just, if you can politicize a global pandemic, I mean, that's saying something. I mean, that's really saying something. So yeah, I think that we all want to feel, like we're on a good team, we all, I think it's really important to me to, if you, that everybody is reasonable. Like, I mean, my first like sort of principle of like studying culture is like, nobody's crazy. Like, for real. I know. You had, that's a, and sure, are there some crazy people? Yes, but as a methodological principle, you want to begin
Right.
that like everybody does what they do for reasons that seem good to them.
Right.
And so, and then try to understand where that comes from. And so that doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It doesn't mean it's right, but it does mean that like, you want to try and understand what is the logic of this world where, what we're crowding into a restaurant becomes like an assertion of, of who I am. Yeah. So it's a, I guess my idea is like when I first started hearing all these things about cultural change, to me, like what's changing is that like kind of the subject got changed, like a different card got pulled out of the deck, for us to talk about. But like, I don't see a whole lot of change. Now, of course, it depends what you mean by culture. Like most of the work that I do is on political opinion, values, things like that. So I don't see that there's going to be much change on that. But of course, I mean, like if you mean culture, like the kind of like what do we do to have fun, that will change. And whether that change will last in the in the long term, or whether it will be short term only, I mean, it's hard to say. Um, but like going to the movies, when will that happen again? Probably not anytime soon. Um, you know, that type of thing. Gym, like going to work out at the gym with a bunch of other people in the class. Like, and so, I don't see this, winding up in a sort of short amount of time. So, so I'm not, so I don't, things are going to change, but not because people's like beliefs or attitudes, I think, are changing, but because like,
So like the underlying ideologies and the manifestations might change, but the underlying ideologies.
yeah, because I think people at this point, I mean, adults basically know what team they're on, and kids are learning what team they're on, and from the people around them. So it's
So
hard
this
to.
is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to
Oh,
interrupt
go
you.
ahead. No, 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 no.
No, I was just going to say, again, the historian in me
Yeah,
would say that what changes, I mean, what's striking, right, is that on the one hand, the political, the clumps that people fall into, if we're going to just like think about the two major parties and a two-party system in the US as being the things that we're thinking about, right? Like there's like people are just going to go to the parties that they have sort of chosen to be affiliated with. But what's changed, again, if you take a 50-year view of it, is what those parties, and not even a 50, let's say a 30-year view of
Sure,
it,
absolutely.
what those parties, maybe 40, but anyway, but like what they announce themselves as sort of being about,
Mhm.
what they're willing to sacrifice
Yeah, sure.
to
Yep.
be that thing, right? So that it's
Absolutely.
people saying that their affiliation is X might be consistent, but they're holding on to something that is itself dynamic.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, so that's kind of great because they aren't even seeing the change that they are then part of.
Absolutely. Well, but what I would say is that the type of dynamic character is really important to specify, because in some rare cases, the dynamic quality is like people are changing, but most of that is that the cohorts are changing. I mean, the reason being a Democrat now means something different than being a Democrat 40 years ago is because, a lot of the Democrats from 40 years ago are dead. And a lot of the people who are in the Democratic Party now were not born yet. And so there are things like racial and gender compositions that have changed. There are things that, like, experiences that in childhood and young adulthood, the kind of media that people consumed when they were young. I mean, so cultures do change, but they primarily change through the mechanism, not only, but they primarily change through the mechanism of young people. And so when the population changes, that's going to leave a big change. So I agree with you that the Democratic Party has changed, but I would say that most of that change is because the actual cells, the people who make up the Democratic Party, have changed. You know what I mean? It's not the same. If it was the same people, like if we were immortal and like, if it was 1940 and all of a sudden in let's say it was 1970, we don't have any kids anymore and nobody dies anymore, we would not have seen the level of change that we have seen. I mean, and I know that's a weird thought experiment. I've never thought of that before, but just trying to imagine something like that. I
I mean,
think,
I would also fold it into the language of narrative and experience, right? So there's the
yeah,
things that people lived through that are formative experiences for them. And
yeah,
then there are the stories that people learn
yeah,
to tell about those formative experiences.
very-
And like our colleague Tim Tyson always says, whoever tells the best story wins. And
yeah,
he means that as like the historian and the historian's craft, but he
sure,
also means the battle over memory that comes after the initial experience, right?
right, yeah,
And so those later generations are also people who come to understand the meaning of the past in a particular way in service to producing a certain kind of present.
yeah. No, I agree with that, and I think, but I guess I would, and we probably don't disagree here, but what I would say is that a lot of times the conclusion is known viscerally in advance. Like, for example, it's not so. Think about two subtly different versions of the story, of like World War II or something. It's not like we told a rose-colored version of what happened during World War II, and then concluded that the U.S. was like the good guy. It's that we knew in advance that the U.S. was the good guy, and that shaped the way
Right.
that the story. So I think so. So I'm not saying that stuff doesn't matter. It does matter, but a lot of it is because we know the conclusion sort of ahead of time. Like we know we're on the right team. So I will tell the story this way.
Right.
It's not like I'll tell the story and then what is the story? So it does depend. But I think that people know viscerally. I mean, imagine what it would feel like to, like, in your social world or my social world, to like convert to Trumpism. You know what I mean? It'd be unlivable. I mean, quite apart from even if you did it as performance art or something, you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't tell anybody that it was an act, and then you a month later you would come out and sort of tell everybody that you just been. It would be unbearable.
Right.
It would be.
It's that episode, the season premiere episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh yes, exactly.
Is wearing the hat in
Yeah,
order to make people like give him space, right?
yes, exactly.
Um,
You're right. Yeah.
and yet, I
Yeah.
mean, and this is another place where we do come together, right? That a good historian, what does Barbara Fields, the historian, says, like taking slave owners seriously does not require taking them literally.
Yeah, sure, yes.
But it does require taking, like, but you do have
Yeah,
to take them seriously,
absolutely.
right? And so we can say that would be unlivable in our social world, but the practice of saying, how does someone get to a place where this isn't just livable, it is desirable and perhaps the only thing imaginable, is an important thing to be
Absolutely.
able to like ask and work towards answering.
No, and I completely agree with that. And that's one of the things that, like in my lab at Keenan Institute, I co-direct the Worldview Lab with Chris Johnston, who's a professor in political science. And one of the things that, we've been working together for a couple of years, and all our PhD students get together and everything. And one of the things we've realized is that we really need like a sort of developmental political science where we look at what this looks like. Like, how do people learn this stuff in childhood and early adolescence? Because I think, by the time you start studying people, even who are in high school, like that, kind of that ship has sailed almost at that point. I mean, there's a lot of details to work out, but a lot of the pieces are in place. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's where my thoughts are going to right now. Is like, how does a person learn? Like, how does a 6-year-old or 8-year-old or 10-year-old in a household learn to to believe in climate change? How do they learn to believe that climate change is a hoax? How do they, so those are, so so what that looks like in a house, like in somebody's just house growing up, because believe it or not, it's probably not a big deal. I mean, most of the time they're going to school, they're doing their homework, they're going to football practice. Well, not so much anymore, but soccer practice or swim practice or whatever. And most people are not political most of the time. They're just doing their life. Most of the time, they're thinking about their yard. They're thinking about, they got to do some repair on the house or whatever, shopping, grocery store, that's things like that. So I don't know. It's but it would be really interesting. That's what we need, I think, is to try and understand how this comes to be, among people who are younger. How do they learn this?
Yeah. I mean, so, well, two questions. One, most people are not political unless the world makes them be so, right?
Yeah,
So how do the like markers, the sort of major markers of social difference that we always go to, race, class, and gender,
yeah,
like affect this? The like, so you've got the sort of aggregate stuff, but when you go into it and start thinking about other things within your data, like
yeah,
how, I mean, I imagine it does change that story of, I mean, every Black coming of age story has the moment in which a child encounters her Blackness
yeah.
through an encounter with white supremacy,
Sure. Yeah,
right?
sure. Absolutely.
And so that child is already moved out of a world where one, they're like, in some ways their group is chosen for them. It's not
Yeah.
their only group by any means, but one of their major groups is chosen in that.
Oh no, that's totally true. I mean, like, I mean, so I was, for example, I'm not religious at all anymore, but I was raised Mormon, and that's when I was probably 15, 16. I was a Republican. I was a libertarian. I read Ayn Rand. I was like, I was, probably more on the libertarian Republican side, and that's partly because my group that I didn't have a part in choosing, my group like had already joined that coalition, and so it was sort of a natural consequence from there, which is not the same thing, but it's like the closest that I can sort of get to understand what it's like to have all these sort of intervening, like we don't just belong to one thing, we belong to lots of different things, and sometimes those things pull us in different directions with this. But it's clear like what the sort of big division is in our society politically right now. There are lots of kinds of divisions. I mean, so socioeconomically, like the way that people are experiencing unemployment and the difficulties of this moment economically, those are not purely split politically. I mean, that's more complicated than that. So there are lots of ways that people's experiences get divided up. I just think politically politically it's pretty crazy. So so yeah. So but I agree with you that it's not just an individual experience. Right. it's yeah, that's shaped profoundly by certainly race, class, gender, religion, lots of different things. Like
sexuality or whatever. Yeah. So we are going to Q&A. I will like put a pin in the question and we can talk about it tonight, or we can talk about it at some point in the future, which is just, as we were talking, I was trying to imagine what our children, like what narrative they are going to have of this moment. Absolutely. And what it will mean. So we started with these shifting foundations, and for them, this is going to be foundational and fundamental. And perhaps you're probably right that what they will then say about it is partially shaped by how they've been conditioned to go in and read it. But I'm
Yeah.
curious to see on the other side, like
Yeah.
what that story looks like.
And I think a lot of it's going to depend on things we don't know yet. Like, it would be silly for me to make too many predictions because, I mean, obviously situations can get serious enough where they do change everything. I mean, obviously, if you think about, like, all of a sudden, if our society, this is not going to happen, but if our society was like suddenly Mad Max, that people's attitudes would change because the environment was changing so radically. So it will depend. I mean, if this lasts a long, long time and has, like, it's already had major consequences and will have major consequences, but it has even, worse consequences than we anticipate, then yeah, I mean, it could really, yeah. So, but we don't know that yet. So it's hard to predict because we don't know how bad it's going to be.
Because things move so quickly.
Yeah,
All right, I'm going to turn to our first question,
okay.
which is, can you discuss someone who makes major change in ideology late in life, such as Derek Black, a white supremacist who became an anti-racist after going to college?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, yeah, I mean, so like I mentioned, I mean, I'm a counterexample to my own sort of theory because I was, raised in a conservative religion and became liberal and sort of, I guess, agnostic or whatever in adulthood. So people can do that. It's just for every person who switches one way, there are people who switch the other way. I mean, if you look at this, so the example that we have really good data on, and again, there's complexities here that we can't fully explore because of the limitations of the nature of the data. But if you look at, for example, there's a question that started in the early 1970s in the General Social Survey about, like, whether interracial marriage should be illegal in the U.S. And so that steadily declined, and it declined until like 2008 they stopped, or 2002 actually, they stopped asking the question because it was like fewer than 10% of people were saying yes. But it went from 40%, down to in early 1970s. And if you look at that, and you basically say, okay, we got two statistical models here. One that says this is from people changing their minds, and one, this is from people just dying and being replaced by younger people with different views. The second one is unquestionably a better account of the data than the other one. So what that means is, and then people will say, well, I know that my grandma changed her view on this, whatever. And I'll tell you, all that means is that on average, I believe you, what it means is on average for every grandma who changed her view to go one way, there was a grandma who changed her view the other way. And we don't hear too much about those stories, but people do change their private attitudes in ways that are not progressive. People do become radicalized in other ways too. So for every person who, changes from being a white supremacist to being believe it or not, there are some people who go the other direction. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it's relatively rare, and that's one of the reasons we pay so much attention to it.
And I think it's important. I think it's actually important to flag that generational shift is not necessarily about inevitable progress, right?
Oh, not at all.
Change goes in a million different directions.
Absolutely, that's really important to note. Yes.
So the second question actually bears on something that I would have asked you but got distracted rambling, which was, about what is, like, so my version of the question, and then I'll read the actual question that's here, is kind of, so are our jobs pointless if, like, what we do as professors are to give students tools to, like, flex their critical thinking in a way that has them continue to be thinking people for the rest of their lives? Yeah. Like, what's the point of doing that if everyone just pops back in place? A more eloquent version of that question comes in the Q&A, where it says, so if all is said or established so young, then how hopeful are you that adults can be persuaded by others who present or come from a different perspective? Mm-hmm. To give an example, I was watching CNN/MSNBC, and I'm more aligned there. But I also watch Fox, or I don't even know what OAN, OAN, to get other perspectives. They are so different, even the commercials. Two worlds exist that do not intersect. When there is no intersection, how can compromises occur?
They can't. I mean, that's the thing is, I think compromises can occur when there are people who have other interests involved, like getting reelected, things like that. So, there are situations where people will, we came to some compromises on Congress came to some compromises on some of the bills, related to CARES Act and things were related to the COVID response, because if they don't do anything, they're all toast. You know what I mean? So they have to, and the economy is toast and everything. So I think people can come to some compromises, but but it's not because they actually agree. It's because they give a little, they take a little, but the idea of real agreement. Now, of course, individual people can agree. And partly that's because that's going to happen when they value the relationship. You know, if I have a relationship with somebody that I really value, for example, a relationship in my family that I really value, then you will be less strident. Maybe they'll be less strident, and hopefully you can at least come to see the other person as being, you know, human, even if you believe deeply. If you believe, you know, deeply that they're wrong. So I think but you're not just gonna like encounter a stranger and be like, okay, let's hash this out. So it's gonna, I think, would be in the context of relationships that you already like are motivated to preserve.
Right. And I think I mean, so I have this like the opposite of a progress regression or whatever narrative that and I assume we're roughly the same age, but that we came of age at a moment when integration was a project that people believed in and were willing to work for in a way that I just don't think that even the sort of average person who's like feels their heart is in the right place is willing to do anymore.
I think that's right. I agree with you.
And you see the consequences of that all over the place, because the way that people come to learn to think through the lives of others is by having something push them to say, like, a life can look like this, or experiences can be like that.
Absolutely.
Right? And so it's not simply we're sitting on different lazy boys watching different news stations, but that the kind of vision of, I mean, to sound sort of ridiculous, but civic nationalism that was sort of late or sort of mid to late century American project has changed.
Yeah, and we can't know exactly what that is, but I mean, like, if you think about, so I'm 43, I guess. My wife's 44.
Feels older every day, right?
Yeah, exactly. One day.
Aged 5 years in the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's true too. But I think, you know, if you look at, it's hard to know like what's going to be significant. But I mean, like when I was when we were adolescents, I mean, there was like the Cold War was still happening. I mean, there was this idea that there was something sort of special about America, and we were on this sort of, and I just wonder and the idea that you would come together as Americans about things. I do wonder, like, whether that idea is just not present in sort of the same way. And we can't know that, you know, we'll see. And I want to address a little bit that issue of, like, are our jobs pointless? I mean, I have sort of a more serious and a less serious response to that. But I guess, like, you know, if things are baked in, then what's good of being a professor? Number one, I think it's that it's not obvious that there's not a hard phase out point, like where it's like you're done being, you know, the clay is just set. Right. I mean, it's a gradual process, and and this is a really hard question, but from everything we can tell, it's probably around the mid 20s. So college students are to some extent in that window. Number one. Number two is that you know, a lot of stuff we do teach them is not going to make it, you know, we don't expect to make a huge difference for everybody. It's just that we might make a difference for some people. And then third, of course, is that you're teaching people, like, you know, skills, and some people need those skills for specific things. So I mean, like, you know, obviously, you know, the liberal arts, social sciences, and the natural sciences are all going to play sort of different roles in that. But I mean, you know, how many people were actually, like, really deeply affected by, like, you know, the literature classes that I was sitting in? I don't know, but I was. And you know, maybe that's just part of what's necessary for you know, how many people who play youth soccer are going to turn into professional athletes? And so we don't make that out and say, well, okay, scrap the whole system, who cares? Right. You know, so it's a credentialing process, and then, you know, some people will be more deeply affected by it.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not that I want to tell them what to think. I just want to teach them that they need to have given some thought, like think about the relationship between evidence and what you want to believe, and make that a tight relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a skill, the skill of just yourself from, you know, and so I agree. It's, you're not trying, I certainly am not trying to teach people what to think, as much as saying, like, look, here are some moves that you should try in your own beliefs, and that you should try in other people's beliefs, to, like, give them a test drive, shake them out. Yeah. Anyway.
Next question. Given the importance of adolescent years in forming people's attitudes and beliefs, how do you think the experience of this pandemic and its politicization will affect the ideology of younger cohorts who are coming of age right now?
I mean, I think it's going to increase the level of subsequent polarization, in my view, because like when I was, well, I don't even use, I'm way too old now for this, but I mean, like, 10 years ago, something like 9/11 was not politicized. Let's even go back to 9/11. 9/11 was not politicized. Now, of course, those are different. Like an attack from an observable external entity and a virus are not the same thing. So you want to be somewhat careful in drawing connections between the two. But that wasn't politicized, and so I think the people who came of age during that period did not see that as so that there was maybe a difference between things that were political and things that were not political. What I wonder is that the long-term cynicism of adolescence in our culture. I mean, I have 4 teenagers essentially, and
Lord.
one's 12, but so he's honorary, but he qualifies. It's I think they are. We try to combat this to some extent, but I mean, they're kind of cynical, I think, about this. I mean, it's just, so I think that if even this can become political, that's what I worry about.
Right. And I'd say to track back to where you began, when you were talking about the sort of like the mistrust of expertise or the mistrust of certain claims of authority. And you see that mistrust coming from right and left, right? And in both cases, with some rooting in histories of trust being violated, right? So it's not, again, to say people might end up in unreasonable places, but not necessarily from unreasonable starting points or what have you. And so to see this moment when the adults who are supposed to be helping or doing something are actually the ones who are like tearing apart the legitimacy, are sort of hammering away at the idea that the institutions that they work for are the institutions that you should believe in. I think.
Well,
what you hope is that that kids are savvier than we give them credit for.
And I think there was more. I mean, like they don't. So like we adults are saying like, surely, when a lot of things about Trump come out, there's been so many moments where liberals have been like, surely this now will be the sort of death knell of this administration. Surely now everyone will see the need for X, Y, or Z. And it just keeps getting pushed back. And what we realize is that a lot of the things that we relied on were norms. They're not laws. I mean, like certain things that happened in the presidency, for example, certain types of things are just like people never did them, not because they were against the law per se, but just because it was just not done. And now I think what that stuff now is so much more radicalized. I think that's what our kids are seeing, is that everything is political. Like masks are political, public health funding is political, everything's political. So that's what I'm worried about, because then it just leads to pure cynicism. It's just,
Again, the contemporary moment has made me realize what an old Southern lady. I have such a strong sense of norms and such a like tisky response to those norms being violated that it's, I mean, again, words stop having meaning at some point, but I think that actually temperamentally, that's a certain kind of conservative. I am temperamentally quite conservative.
Sure.
I think because at the end of the day, I want institutions to be institutions that do institutional work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think, you can go back to, there's a strain of conservatism that is very, sort of Burkean, which understands the importance of institutions, but there's also a strain that essentially denies the existence of institutions, a sort of Thatcherite, notion of institute that's, well, it's not a thing. So I think that what we're seeing is sort of the libertarian strain of conservatism, sort of saying like, there is no public health. It's like, if you're worried about it, stay home.
Right.
And that's not, unfortunately, that just mathematically doesn't work. It'd be like saying, hey, if you want to build, a steel processing plant, my neighbor wants to build a processing plant on the, chicken processing plant in their yard. Hey, that's their land. Go ahead. Believe me, you'd be singing a different tune if they did that. You know what I mean? So So it's just, everybody has the idea of like what an externality is at one level, or you could make them understand. But it's so much simpler to say, hey, you're worried about this, stay home.
Right.
You know? And it's like, but that's not how it works, unfortunately. I mean, I wish it was. I wish it was that simple, because then we wouldn't have to argue.
Right.
You know?
But, okay, one final question. And I have to say, we have so many great questions that we're not going to get a chance to get to.
Not too
And
much.
I'm sorry, yeah. I blame Steve Vasey.
Yeah.
So on our final question, I'll ask the final question, and then I'll remind y'all before we even get to that we will send out a link to a recording of this conversation in the upcoming days. And then we'll have another new great conversation next week too. But as the final one to close us out, do you think having to live in relative isolation right now will lead to further trending towards bowling alone, per Robert Putnam? Or that the pandemic may teach most of us how integral community is and reverse the bowling alone trend?
I mean, number one, I think that some of that some of the bowling alone social capital stuff is a little bit overstated because of the kind of measurement that we do, because some of it has just been like a transition from one kind of solidarity or one kind of like form of association to other kinds of association. So yeah, so bowling leagues are down, but WhatsApp groups are, those are a thing. And those are usually with people who are, what I mean? So like I'm in a WhatsApp group with a bunch of guys that I watch soccer with, and like, that were exactly people who would have been in a bowling league, 40 years ago. So to some extent, I question the premise of that. But I think if you look at, some of the in light of what we're experiencing now, it's surprising to look back and see how little the world changed as a result, for example, of the Spanish flu epidemic. And so I think what we'll do in most of our forms of social organization is we'll just sort of bounce back to what we were. Now, will some things change? Yes, but I don't think the level of interaction is going to decline. I think it might take different forms, and different people have different views about like the relative value of something like a Zoom happy hour with your friends or whatever, as opposed to the real thing. But I do think that humans are fundamentally social. I mean, like that's what we are, and so we will find ways to hang out. We will find ways to associate. And so I don't see that changing. But I mean, clearly, this has been one of the difficulties of this experience. Has been, and for some people, it's been, I'm in here with 6 people in my containment zone, so loneliness has not been my problem particularly, but for some people it is, and so that goes on. There are going to be consequences to that, but I don't anticipate that will have long-term effects on our sort of desire to socialize or to isolate or anything like that. That's my view on that.
So thank you, and thank you all. And speaking of our desire to hang out, I'll be back here next Thursday with Jolie Olcott, where we'll be talking about care in the time of the pandemic. And then the week after that, we will be talking about terrible television, which I'm super excited about, given that the season finale of The Masked Singer is next week. So thank you all. And Steve, mega thanks to you.
Oh, thank you. This was fun.
And I am sorry that we didn't get to all of your questions. Please come back and ask more questions. And I'll see all of y'all virtually in some way, in some form of later. All right. Bye.